All right, ready for a deep dive? We're diving into conservative education reform today.
Sounds good to me.
They're cracking open mandate for leadership, the conservative promise.
Straight from the Heritage Foundation.
They're taking on the Department of Education, and let me tell you, they don't pull any punches.
No, they don't. This chapter hits you right off the bat with some eye-opening stats about education in America.
Yeah, like how we've poured trillions into education since '65, but reading scores haven't moved an inch in 30 years.
It's pretty shocking when you think about it.
And math. Forget about it.
Yeah.
Scores have plummeted, especially since 1990. What's going on there?
Well, this chapter points to those very numbers, the ones from the National Assessment of Educational Progress.
The NAEP, right?
Exactly. They say it's proof that the feds being so involved in education might actually be hurting more than helping.
So more money, more bureaucracy, more programs.
Yeah.
But student achievement is flatlining.
That's their argument.
Uh-huh.
They call it a shadow education department, this huge bureaucracy at the state level that's ballooned because of federal mandates and funding.
And it's gotten that big because of federal influence.
They say so, yeah. They even cite a study that found state education agencies now have a ridiculous 48,000 employees.
48,000? Seriously?
That's 10 times bigger than the actual Department of Education.
10 times. That's insane. So what's their solution? Just scrap the whole thing?
Pretty much. This chapter wants to dismantle the Department of Education entirely.
Wow.
They believe that education works best closer to home states, local communities, and most of all, families.
It's definitely a bold idea. But what about all the current Department of Education programs? What happens to funding for special education or support for low-income students?
They suggest moving some programs to different agencies, like shifting Title I, which funds disadvantaged students, to Health and Human Services.
HHS.
Yeah, their reasoning is that HHS already has the setup and the know-how to help those specific groups. It's about streamlining, they say, not abandoning.
So instead of clean sweep, they're talking about strategically reorganizing things within the federal government. Like a reset, but more thought out.
Precisely. They want a smaller federal footprint in education, but not a complete exit. Now, one of their most interesting proposals is about education savings accounts, or ESAs.
Yeah, essays, right. I've heard that term thrown around a lot lately. Could you give us a rundown of how ESAs are supposed to work?
Of course. Imagine this. You have an account specifically for your child's education, funded by the government.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
But here's the key difference. You get to decide how that money is spent. That's the beauty of an ESA.
So parents could use those funds for private school, tuition, tutoring, online courses, things like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It could even cover specialized therapies or curriculum materials.
So it gives parents direct control over how their child's education dollars are spent, which is a really appealing idea, especially for families who feel like their assigned public school isn't the right fit,
Right.
or for parents who have children with unique learning needs who might benefit from a more tailored approach.
Absolutely. It allows for more customization and flexibility.
But, and I'm sure you saw this coming, it does raise some concerns for me.
Like what?
Wouldn't this kind of system give an advantage to families who have more resources and knowledge about how to navigate it? I mean, wouldn't they benefit more than families who might not have the time or resources to, say, research different educational options or advocate for their child's needs as effectively?
Those are definitely important considerations.
It seems like there's a real risk of exacerbating existing inequalities.
It's a valid concern, and the chapter acknowledges
How
that
they do.
they stress that any ESA program needs strong accountability built in.
That makes sense.
They point to Arizona as a possible model.
What have they done with ESAs?
They were early adopters, started back in 2011.
Wow, that early.
And now it's statewide. Their focus is on empowering parents to be education consumers, which they believe encourages competition and innovation.
So it's like applying free market principles to education.
Exactly. The idea is that schools and education providers would have to step up their game to attract students and funding.
And that would theoretically lead to better outcomes for everyone.
That's their argument. This chapter argues that this competition would benefit everyone by boosting quality and offering more choices.
It's definitely a compelling argument, but I still have questions about oversight and accountability. How do we make sure these funds are used responsibly and effectively? And what about those concerns about potentially making existing inequalities even worse?
Those are really important questions.
I mean, it's one thing to say parents should have more control, but how do we ensure that this control actually translates to better outcomes for all students, not just those from more advantaged backgrounds?
Those are the million-dollar questions, right? It's a matter of getting those details right.
Absolutely.
You need ways to hold schools accountable and make sure the system is fair.
It's a tough balancing act for
It
sure.
really is.
And that's where the rubber meets the road, right? It's easy to talk about big changes, but actually making them work in a way that's fair for everyone. That's the real challenge.
It is. Turning these ideas into a system that works and is equitable, that's a whole other ballgame.
No doubt. Speaking of challenges, let's move on to those big federal programs we mentioned earlier, Title I and IDEA.
Yeah.
You said they want to move them to Health and Human Services.
Right.
But they don't stop there, do they?
Yeah.
They also propose this thing called micro-ESAs.
Yeah, micro-ESAs.
So instead of the money going straight to school districts,
Like it does now.
it would go to families in the form of these micro-ESAs.
Exactly.
And parents could use those funds for a bunch of different things,
Whatever fits their child's needs.
like special tutoring, therapy, assistive technology, even just buying curriculum materials.
It's all about tailoring it to the individual student.
So it's basically taking this idea of parent-directed funding and applying it to special education and support for low-income students.
Precisely. They want to give parents the power to make those decisions.
Interesting.
They argue that this would streamline these programs, cut through red tape, and really empower families to fight for their kids' needs.
It's a pretty big shift.
It is.
I can see how it could lead to more personalized support for students.
Which is what they're going for.
But it also makes me wonder about unintended consequences again.
Like what's...
Well, could we end up with a situation where families with more resources or knowledge about the system are just better equipped to use these micro-ESAs than families who might not have the time or the information to navigate it all?
That's a real concern.
Like, we're back to that same question about equality.
It's a theme that keeps coming up.
And it's a big one.
It is. And it's something they acknowledge in the chapter.
They do.
They emphasize the need for really strong support systems for families making the switch.
So it's not just about handing over the money and saying good luck.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
You need to give families the information, the resources, maybe even advocacy services to make sure they can use these accounts effectively.
Especially families who might not have the time or resources to figure it out on their own.
Absolutely. It has to be equitable.
It sounds like a system with a ton of different parts, and each one has to be working properly for the whole thing to work.
It's complicated, that's for sure.
And, of course, we can't talk about education reform without talking about ideology and politics. That's the elephant in the room.
Always.
And this chapter definitely doesn't shy away from those topics.
Not even a little bit.
They really lean into them, especially when it comes to civil rights, gender identity, what they call woke politics in education.
They see those as big issues in education today.
They seem especially worried about what they see as federal overreach in these areas.
Exactly. They think the federal government is getting too involved in things that should be left up to states, communities, and parents.
So their answer is basically a more hands-off approach from the federal government.
That's the gist of it. Let those decisions be made at a more local level.
It's all part of this bigger theme we've been discussing.
Decentralizing power in education.
Bringing those decisions back to those closest to the students.
Exactly.
It's a perspective that's bound to be controversial.
Oh, definitely.
But it really highlights the different values and beliefs that are driving this whole conversation about education reform.
It really does.
It's not just about facts and figures. It's about what we believe.
It's about our vision for education.
Exactly. But before we get too deep into that philosophical debate, let's switch gears to their proposals for higher education.
Okay, higher ed.
Because if you thought their K-12 reforms were bold,
Buckle up.
wait till you hear what they have in store for college.
Let's just say they're not afraid to shake things up.
They're not messing around, are they? They want to overhaul the whole system. Accreditation, student loans, how we fund international studies.
They're tackling it all.
Okay, so let's start with accreditation. They want to completely revamp the system.
Yeah.
For those of us who aren't experts on higher education, what does that even mean?
Well, right now, the federal government has a ton of power when it comes to accreditation. They basically decide which accrediting agencies are legitimate.
And those agencies are the ones that determine if a college or university is good enough.
Exactly. So the feds have a huge influence on which schools are considered up to par.
And this chapter wants to take that power away from the federal government and just hand it over to the states.
That's their proposal.
So instead of one national standard, we'd have 50 different state-level approaches to accreditation. Wouldn't that create chaos?
They argue it would break what they call the accreditation cartel. They think that by giving states control, you would see more competition and innovation in higher education.
So states could decide what good looks like for their own colleges and universities. Interesting idea, but I could see how that could get really complicated.
It would definitely be a big shift.
And speaking of big shifts, we can't talk about higher education without talking about student loans.
The elephant in the room, right?
Exactly. And they don't hold back on that issue either.
Nope, not at all.
They want to completely reverse the 2010 student loan federalization. So the government would basically get out of the business of making student loans.
That's the idea.
Wow. So we go back to a system where private banks and lenders are calling the shots? That seems like a risky move.
It would be a massive change. They argue that going back to a market-based system would make lenders be more responsible and could even push colleges to keep their costs down.
It's a controversial idea, to say the least, especially with all the talk about student loan forgiveness these days.
It's a hot-button issue for sure.
And while we're on the subject of controversial, they also get into the issue of international studies and how they're funded. They specifically call out what they see as the Chinese government having too much influence on American college campuses.
They see that as a serious problem.
And their solution is to shift funding to programs that are more in line with American interests.
That's the gist of it, yeah. They want to see international studies programs focus more on free markets and democratic values.
It's all starting to sound pretty familiar, isn't it? This emphasis on individual freedom, less government intervention, and letting the free market drive solutions.
It's a theme that runs through this whole chapter. It's their guiding philosophy, and it shapes how they approach everything from pre-K to college and beyond.
And they wrap up by calling for total transparency in education. They want more data made public about how schools are spending money, how family structure impacts student success, even the effects of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives.
They really believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant.
That by making everything transparent, parents and taxpayers will have the information they need to hold schools accountable.
And make informed choices about their kids' education.
Wow, that's a lot to process. We've covered so much ground today, from abolishing the Department of Education to ESAs, micro-ESAs, accreditation overhauls, student loan reform. The list goes on.
And we've only just scratched the surface. This chapter is jam-packed with ideas.
That's what we do here on the Deep Dive. Though we take these complex issues, break them down, and hopefully leave you with more questions than answers.
Because that's what good scholarship should do, make you think critically and challenge your own assumptions.
If there's one thing I'm taking away from this deep dive, it's that there are no easy answers when it comes to education reform.
No easy answers, just a lot of tough questions.
And as we're all trying to figure out what the best path forward is, we have to remember what's truly at stake.
The future of our children and the kind of society we want them to inherit.
Well said. That's what makes this conversation so important. And that note, that's our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the heart of education reform.